Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. Doreen Brooks had lived in the Willow Haven retirement community for nearly a decade. At 74 years old, she relished the quiet consistency of her days: morning coffee by the window, card games with a close circle of neighbors, and weekly volunteer shifts at the local library. The residents mostly got along, and while the community's homeowners association enforced certain guidelines, it was nothing out of the ordinary, at first. Then came Esther Knowles. From the moment Esther, a woman in her mid-60s, arrived as the newly elected president of the HOA, everything changed. Her crisp white hair was always pinned back. Her large collection of floral blouses made her look more grandmotherly than tyrannical. But the second she opened her mouth, her voice practically dripped with condescension. She addressed every problem, however trivial, with dramatic flair, making neighbors feel like disobedient children caught with their hands in a cookie jar. It didn't help that she insisted everyone call her Madam President. Doreen saw the first red flag when Esther demanded that each property's front yard be stripped of existing flowers and replaced with a uniform breed of marigolds, regardless of individual preference or cost. Doreen's neighbor, James, who had spent years cultivating heirloom roses his late wife had cherished, objected to removing them. Esther took that refusal personally. She showed up with an unexpected letter from the HOA board, citing aesthetic violations, threatening daily fines if James didn't comply. He complied. At first, he had limited funds and no appetite for a legal battle. But James wasn't the only target. Soon, Esther circulated rumors about dangerous behavior. She posted official-looking notices that certain properties might fail a pending safety inspection. The exact nature of these inspections was never explained, leaving half the neighborhood confused and anxious. Doreen, at the time, hadn't been singled out, but she felt a chill whenever she saw Esther's white hair bobbing down the sidewalk, flanked by two newly appointed HOA enforcers. Esther's approach was eerily swift and effective. More quietly, she also started meddling in who visited the community. Doreen's daughter, Rebecca, lived an hour away and frequently stopped by to help Doreen with groceries or to fix the occasional leaky sink. One Saturday, Rebecca arrived to find a note taped to Doreen's front door: all non-resident vehicles must register with the HOA office prior to entry or risk towing. Doreen had never heard of such a policy, certainly not at Willow Haven. But Esther insisted it was in the bylaws, though no one seemed to recall that clause before. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood atmosphere turned from cordial to downright oppressive. The stress was palpable. Shaken by the new rules, many residents tiptoed around, afraid to push back. Several couldn't afford the fines, and others just wanted to avoid conflicts. Doreen felt torn. She valued peace, but everything about Esther's leadership felt invasive, manipulative, and downright improper. She dreaded the idea of living under an authoritarian regime in her twilight years. That tension boiled over when Doreen's next-door neighbor, Lucille, who used a walker, found a threatening letter taped to her window stating she needed to maintain the exterior in an accessible fashion or face daily penalties. Confused, Lucille had no idea what that meant. She'd always kept her property neat. When Lucille tried to seek an explanation, Esther's only response was a cryptic mention of safety concerns. The final straw came one evening when Doreen was relaxing in her backyard, inhaling the fragrance of her new summer blooms. She heard a yelp, followed by shouting near Lucille's house. Rushing over, Doreen found Lucille distraught, trembling as she pointed at her newly demolished ramp. The ramp, which her late husband had installed years ago so she could safely enter and exit the back door, had been ripped apart and shoved to the side. A chipped piece of plywood remained, the rest scattered like storm debris. And who else but Esther stood in the driveway, arms folded, her two henchmen behind her, proudly proclaiming that the structure was non-compliant. Lucille's face was ashen. Tears welled in her eyes. "But I need that ramp," she insisted. "You can't just tear up something my husband built for me." Esther cut her off with that syrupy condescension. "Now, Ms. Parks, you must understand, this is for your own good. The ramp doesn't match the new safety requirements. If you want to remain in Willow Haven, you'll keep your property up to code." Doreen's chest tightened. This wasn't just an overbearing HOA rule, It was a calculated, heartless attack on an elderly woman's independence. She glared at Esther and demanded an explanation, her voice shaking with anger. "You'd better be careful, Doreen," Esther responded flatly. "You wouldn't want the HOA to discover anything problematic at your house, now would you?" Shaken but furious, Doreen immediately phoned the local police, explaining that someone had destroyed Lucille's property without permission. Esther, smug as ever, insisted she had the authority to remove the ramp if it wasn't code compliant. By the time the officers arrived, it became a confusing back and forth. No one had heard of any official notice about a ramp removal. But Esther waved some papers in front of the officers, claiming they proved her right. The police looked perplexed and, lacking clarity, told both parties this was a civil matter and left, instructing everyone to remain calm. But Doreen's calm was evaporating fast. She comforted Lucille, who was absolutely devastated. At that moment, Doreen decided enough was enough. She had never been one for public confrontation, but her friend needed help, and so did many of the other retirees, who lacked the energy or resources to fight. She vowed to find a way to push back, legally, if necessary. As Doreen got ready for bed that night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. She knew that Esther, with her manipulative ways, wouldn't stop at the ramp. Next time, it could be Doreen's home targeted. Or she might lose the ability to have her daughter visit. If the HOA could trample Lucille so easily, they could do worse to others. Doreen resolved to gather evidence, gather allies, and, if it came to it, drag the situation into court. Little did she know that Esther was one step ahead. By the following weekend, a bizarre letter arrived in Doreen's mailbox, a direct summons to a mandatory HOA hearing. She was formally accused of instigating anti-community behavior. The letter threatened immediate expulsion if she didn't attend. Fear mixed with fury in Doreen's heart. She had only done what any good neighbor would, stand up to a bully. But in Willow Haven these days, the bully was the one calling the shots. Doreen clutched the letter, anger fanning across her chest. She allowed herself one fleeting moment of doubt. Was it possible to fight someone so smug, so determined to twist the rules to her advantage? Then she recalled Lucille's stricken face and James's uprooted roses, and she realized she had no choice. If the neighborhood was ever to be free from Esther's intimidation, someone would have to stand tall in the storm. Doreen might be 74, but she wasn't weak. She had one day to prepare before the hearing. She steeled herself, picked up her phone, and began dialing neighbors one by one. Doreen entered the HOA hearing the next afternoon expecting at least a table with the association's board present. Instead, she found a room at the community clubhouse with only Esther and two men she didn't recognize, Esther's so-called enforcers, apparently doubling as judge and jury. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the scene. Doreen clutched her notes in shaky hands, determined not to show weakness. "Have a seat," Esther said, chin held high. "Let's review your alleged actions." Doreen noticed how the men never introduced themselves nor offered a handshake. They just glowered. Esther proceeded to lay out a litany of fabricated charges: interference in standard HOA practices, inciting neighbor discord, willful disregard for community safety guidelines, and so on. The language was so theatrical it would have been comical under different circumstances. Doreen calmly refuted each claim, relying on the neighborhood's actual bylaws for evidence. She had done her homework. Willow Haven's bylaws hadn't changed in a decade, and absolutely nothing authorized the destruction of a disabled resident's ramp, nor mandated that everyone must plant the same type of flower or register visiting family members. She held up the printed pages in triumph, her voice trembling only slightly. But Esther refused to back down. She kept repeating that the bylaws had been recently updated, though she had no official record of a vote or a recognized procedure. She spoke like a politician cornered in a scandal, glossing over specifics, deflecting with intangible phrases like "for the greater good." After an hour of back and forth, the so-called hearing ended with Esther smirking, while Doreen felt a knot in her stomach. A typed verdict declared Doreen would be placed on a behavioral probation. One more infraction and she'd be subject to immediate expulsion from Willow Haven. Doreen stared at the paper, mouth agape. She had lived there almost 10 years, and she was on probation as if she were some unruly teenager? That evening, Doreen gathered with neighbors on her front porch, James, Lucille, and a few others who'd had enough. They commiserated and realized that the situation was escalating to a dangerous point. Several neighbors, especially those in their 80s, were too exhausted to resist. "She uses our own fears against us," Lucille said, her voice wavering. "She knows many of us can't afford to move." Doreen laid out her plan. They'd involve law enforcement again, only this time with actual evidence, not just phone calls in the heat of the moment. They'd collect photographs, statements, and any shred of official documentation. She encouraged each neighbor to note every suspicious letter or threat. If Esther had forged any supposed bylaws, it might be time to seek legal help. A sense of unity spread among them. Before they parted ways, Lucille managed a small, hopeful grin. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I've never been in a real court battle," she said. "Guess there's a first time for everything." They worked furiously over the next week. Doreen helped James compile pictures of his uprooted rose bushes and the cryptic violation letter from the day they were torn out. Lucille took photographs of her demolished ramp. Another neighbor, Howard, discovered that his mailbox had been tampered with. He had a photo of a suspicious scratch mark near the lock. Mail tampering was a federal offense. They couldn't prove who'd done it yet, but it felt like a pattern. With each piece of evidence, Doreen felt more confident they had the makings of a strong case. One surprising ally came from an unlikely place, the local mail carrier. A friendly woman named Karen, no relation to Esther's Karen-like persona, testified that she witnessed strangers fidgeting with Howard's mailbox one early morning. While she couldn't swear they were HOA affiliates, she was sure one of them resembled the tall, broad-shouldered man who often accompanied Esther. Encouraged, Doreen and the others approached a local attorney, a graying man in his late 50s named Marshall Green. He listened intently, occasionally tapping a pen against his notepad. "HOA disputes can be messy," he said, frowning. "But I've rarely heard of anything this brazen. Unauthorized destruction of property, intimidation, forced compliance. If what you're saying is true and can be documented, you might have grounds for a lawsuit, or, at the very least, a restraining order against certain individuals." He offered to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA board, demanding an immediate halt to any further harassment or property alterations. If that failed, he'd consider filing a civil suit. Marshall's calm, methodical approach brought comfort to Doreen. He explained that if the HOA board, or Esther specifically, truly lacked the legal authority for these changes, they were opening themselves up to serious liability. While the group waited for Esther's official reply, Lucille installed a temporary metal ramp, with the help of James and a few other residents, so she could safely leave her home again. Every hour, they half expected the enforcers to appear and tear it down, but there was no sign of them. They seemed to be lying low, likely waiting for their next move. During that lull, Doreen found a small note slipped under her door. A single line, typed in bold capital letters, "Mind your business or face consequences." Her heart thumped. She told herself it might be a prank, but deep down, she knew it had to be connected to Esther or her cronies. She reported the threat to the local police station, who encouraged her to keep them informed. Doreen gave them a copy of the note, the prior evidence, and Marshall's name. The officer filing the report looked genuinely concerned. Still, without concrete proof linking Esther to the note, the police couldn't arrest anyone. One afternoon, while Doreen was out grocery shopping, a neighbor called her in a panic. Apparently, two men claiming to be with HOA security were seen pounding on Doreen's door. They looked agitated, peering through the windows, even rattling the back doorknob. By the time she arrived home, they were gone. Nothing was missing, but her doormat had been flipped, and her deck chairs were shoved aside, as if someone had been searching for something. That was the final straw. Doreen marched into Marshall Green's office the next morning, eyes brimming with a mix of fear and determination. "They're breaking into people's mailboxes, smashing property, and now trying to break into my house," she said. "I can't let this continue." Marshall nodded solemnly, picking up the phone. He called the police chief directly, citing potential criminal trespass. The police chief, aware that a group of seniors was being harassed, said he'd send an officer over to document everything. They also called a judge to see about a protective order for those who felt threatened. The next day, the police arrived at Willow Haven with an official order demanding that Esther cease any contact with Doreen except through legal counsel. It was a small victory, but for Doreen, it felt like a shield, albeit a fragile one. As the officer served the papers, Esther's face twisted with barely concealed rage. Her two sidekicks bristled with hostility, but they remained silent, probably under orders. Doreen hoped that maybe, just maybe, Esther would back off. But that night, James knocked frantically on Doreen's door. There had been another incident. The windows of his workshop in the backyard were smashed, and scrawled across the wall in red paint were the words, "Trust the HA or leave." The final pieces of the puzzle were snapping into place. This was no longer a matter of petty fines. They were dealing with individuals who believed they could terrorize an entire community to get what they wanted. If they'd stooped to vandalism and intimidation, who knew how far they'd go? Doreen and her group filed a collective police report. Photos of the vandalized workshop, plus the scrawled threats, now sat in the hands of local law enforcement. They had enough to take the matter to a higher level, perhaps even criminal charges. All this turmoil soon erupted into a legal showdown. Marshall initiated a lawsuit on behalf of the residents. Esther was served court papers, instructing her and any other involved HOA members to appear before a judge. If they couldn't prove their authority for these destructive acts and intimidation tactics, they'd face consequences. In the calm before the court hearing, Doreen felt a mixture of relief and dread. This would either end well for them or escalate further. But she'd gone too far to turn back. She'd seen enough heartbreak among her neighbors, particularly Lucille, who'd lost faith in the system to protect her. Meanwhile, Willow Haven was abuzz with chatter and speculation. Some residents avoided the drama, others quietly cheered Doreen's courage. It became the talk of the local diner, the grocery store, even the library where Doreen volunteered. But even with the lawsuit looming, Esther showed no sign of remorse. She walked around with her chin higher than ever, openly smirking at Doreen whenever their paths crossed. At night, Doreen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering what life had been like before this hostility took hold. Neighbors once shared recipes and birthday cakes. Now they shared anxious glances and broken windows. She clung to one hope: the truth, shining through when they finally stood before a judge, might shatter Esther's chokehold on Willow Haven once and for all. The day of the court hearing arrived bright and sunny, a stark contrast to the foreboding tension that weighed on everyone involved. Doreen felt her stomach churn as she stood outside the courthouse in her best dress. Lucille was with her, supported by James on one side and her walker on the other. Several neighbors who had submitted statements came as well, determined to see justice done. Esther showed up fashionably late, accompanied by her two muscular enforcers in ill-fitting suits. She had hired a flashy attorney who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a high-stakes corporate drama. Inside, the courtroom was a small, modest space. Doreen's attorney, Marshall, laid out the case methodically. He began by introducing each piece of evidence: photographs of destroyed ramps, torn-out flowers, vandalized windows, the menacing notes, and a written statement from the mail carrier who'd seen unauthorized tampering. He also showcased the original bylaws to prove that no official changes had been voted on, despite Esther's insistence to the contrary. Esther's attorney tried to dismiss the residents' claims as hearsay, painting Esther as a well-intentioned HOA president who was simply misunderstood. When asked directly about the ramp incident, Esther claimed it was old and hazardous. Lucille, voice quivering, testified how the ramp had been carefully maintained and essential for her mobility. Her sorrowful account, coupled with photos of the intact ramp before it was ripped out, visibly moved the judge. Then came the big twist: Marshall had somehow obtained records from the county land office. They showed that Esther had recently purchased a property management stake in Willow Haven, without any disclosure to the other residents, and was rumored to be reselling individual units for a higher profit once she forced older occupants out. She was essentially trying to flip the community. She'd orchestrated the intimidation campaign to scare off longtime owners so she could either buy their homes at a fraction of the cost or force compliance with outrageous new fees that would increase her stake. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Doreen turned to Lucille, who shook her head in disbelief. They had suspected financial motives, but not something quite so calculated. The judge glanced over the documents, eyebrows knitting with skepticism. He questioned Esther directly, who stammered through excuses about protecting property values. The highlight came when James, a retired accountant, was called to the stand. James calmly explained a paper trail he'd pieced together, mysterious new fees that certain residents had been charged, checks that made their way back to a hidden LLC in Esther's name. By the time he was done, the judge's expression had hardened significantly. Esther's attorney tried to pivot, claiming it was all perfectly legal. But the judge was less concerned with the mere existence of an LLC than with the underhanded tactics Esther and her associates used: threats, vandalism, trespassing, destruction of personal property. The judge asked pointedly, "Did you or your associates instruct anyone to damage or remove Ms. Parks's ramp?" Esther's attorney hemmed and hawed, providing no clear denial. Marshall then introduced the final bombshell, a police report filed by another elderly resident who had recently discovered a hidden recording device in her living room lamp, placed there by a maintenance worker apparently connected to the HOA. While evidence was still being gathered, it was enough to suggest a possible pattern of illegal surveillance. The judge's eyes widened in absolute disapproval. Esther's attorney, visibly flustered now, attempted to shift the blame onto the overzealous enforcers, insisting that Esther herself was unaware of their extreme measures. It rang hollow. The judge seemed unconvinced. After a midday recess, the judge returned, voice echoing in the near-empty chambers. He condemned the violations of privacy and property, stating that the real estate profiteering scheme was deeply concerning. He granted a preliminary injunction against any further enforcement action by Esther's faction of the HOA. In addition, he levied immediate fines for the damages to Lucille's ramp and James's workshop. Further legal proceedings would follow to address possible civil and criminal charges. The hush that fell over the courtroom was electric. Esther's face had turned a mottled red, her confident mask shattered. She stormed out of the courtroom before it was fully adjourned, her attorney scrambling to catch up. The final blow came when the officers present stepped forward to serve her with yet another notice, this time for suspected mail tampering and trespassing. She tried to brush them aside, but the uniformed men blocked her path. Doreen remained rooted to the spot, hardly believing the day's outcome. Though the fight wasn't entirely over, they had effectively clipped Esther's wings. The judge's stern words echoed in her mind: "In a civilized society, one does not run an HA like a personal kingdom." Outside, reporters from a local station hovered by the doors, apparently tipped off by someone within the community. Doreen, Lucille, and James found themselves in front of a camera, describing the intimidation they endured and celebrating the judge's decision. It felt surreal, but they stood united, sending a clear message to any unscrupulous HOA president who might be watching: seniors are not easy marks. Over the following weeks, the mood in Willow Haven transformed. The intimidation letters ceased overnight. Esther stopped appearing in the neighborhood altogether. Some whispered that she'd sold her interest in the community and moved away to avoid further legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, the board held an emergency meeting to select a new, interim president. Doreen's phone rang off the hook with neighbors urging her to accept a nomination. At first, Doreen laughed at the idea. "I'm 74, she reminded them. "What do I know about running an HOA?" But the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. If she could restore fairness and decency, maybe she could ensure that no one else endured what Lucille had to endure. A fresh start. Lucille's ramp was rebuilt, sturdier than ever. James's workshop windows were replaced, and he planted new rose bushes, a gift from the neighbors. The local handyman even spruced up the community sign, adding a colorful mural that read, "Willow Haven, where neighbors are family." It wasn't official signage, just an expression of renewed hope. One evening, as Doreen sat quietly on her porch, the phone rang. Marshall was calling with an update. Criminal investigations into Esther's finances were moving forward. Several outraged families from other properties she'd managed had also come forward. She might face charges well beyond Willow Haven's borders. Doreen felt a wave of relief, mingled with compassion for those who had suffered in other places. She prayed that no one else had to go through what she and her neighbors did. Then, setting the phone aside, she turned her attention back to the setting sun, the sky awash in gentle purples and oranges. The community had been battered, but it wasn't broken. In the weeks that followed, Doreen officially accepted the interim HOA presidency. Her first order of business? An open meeting where everyone, regardless of age or ability, could share ideas and concerns. She hoped it would symbolize a new dawn for Willow Haven. Folks turned up in droves, some bringing trays of cookies and coffee, others excited to finally have a voice in their own community. Toward the end of the evening, Lucille took the floor, her voice soft but resolute. "We all thank you, Doreen, for not bending to tyranny. Because of you, I can sleep at night, knowing I won't wake up to find my ramp torn down again." A round of applause rose up, echoing against the clubhouse walls. Doreen's eyes glistened. Months later, as the legal dust settled, Doreen's leadership ushered in a sense of genuine camaraderie. The newly revised bylaws were transparent, not forced upon unsuspecting neighbors. Instead of uniform marigolds, residents planted what they loved, some roses, some sunflowers, others proud vegetable gardens. Visitors could come and go without fear of towing or harassment. It wasn't a perfect community, conflicts happened, as they do anywhere. But the difference was that now, everyone mattered, and no one was powerless. Over time, Doreen found that her new role was less about telling people what to do and more about listening, guiding, and, occasionally, defending them from any echoes of tyranny. She often reflected on that day in court, the day a bully thought she could subjugate a group of retirees for profit, and the day those retirees stood up, refused to be victims, and took back their power. That memory brought her more pride than she ever expected at her age. And so life at Willow Haven moved forward, no longer overshadowed by intimidation. The once silenced residents now had the reassurance that if anyone tried to bring terror to their door again, they'd be met with unity and resolve. And no amount of faux authority or fancy words could break that bond.